In part 5 of chapter 13, we're going to take a look at a natural experiment in life history evolution. This experiment is on the Virginia possum, and it points out some of the major concepts associated with senescence. So when we look at life history, one of the important things to notice is that there are different types of mortality. So the reason why organisms die can vary. One of the types of mortality we look at is called ecological mortality. And ecological mortality is sort of extrinsic to the individual. It's things like predators, disease, accidents that happen. So these aren't things that an organism could physiologically overcome, right? They're part of the external features of their environment. And then we have physiological mortality. This is more intrinsic. So this is more the sort of dying of old age idea. So tissues and organs wear out, and because of that, they don't function as well. And so mortality occurs as that decline in function occurs. So this is within the organism. So clearly selection can work on changing the aging process of the organs. It has to really respond to these external factors such as predators. It obviously cannot change that, but it can respond to it. So how selection works on life history really depends very much on what is the primary mode of mortality in the organism you're looking at. Does it have high ecological mortality, or is that low? Does it have high physiological mortality, or is that low? And that will put very different selective pressures on organisms. And so when we look at life histories, that is one of the primary questions we have to start off with in order to understand these life history patterns that we see, because we do see very broad patterns. We do see in nature many organisms that are very short-lived. They have small offspring, they have a lot of offspring, they don't provide parental care. In ecology, we sometimes look at those as what we call R-selected species. Then we have, on the other hand, organisms that are very large-bodied, they're very competitive, they wait and reproduce later in life, they have large offspring, and they typically have fewer offspring and often provide parental care. And those are called K-selected species. And so we have two very different patterns, and of course there are shades in between, but we tend to have these two basic patterns of life history, and those hinge very much on what these mortality factors are. So we'll take a look at these mortality factors. The idea here is that if an organism lives longer, and it will experience the effects of these harmful mutations that accumulate, this antagonistic pleiotropy that we talked about. If they have lower ecological mortality, then we'll probably see delayed senescence. So we'll probably see these harmful mutations extending later in life, and we'll see these pleiotropic effects being sort of more minimized and occurring later in life if there's low ecological mortality. So the idea basically is that if there's an expectation that an organism, not that the organism itself expects it, but right, if there is an expectation for this species that it will live longer, then selection actually favors the delayed senescence and the delayed antagonistic pleiotropic effects. If the organism is going to die young anyway because ecological factors take it out, well, now natural selection doesn't really favor delayed senescence because no organism really benefits from delayed senescence. It doesn't have any higher fitness by delaying senescence as opposed to having senescence occur earlier. So if there is this trade-off, then if you're likely to meet your demise through ecological mortality, really selection favors you to start reproducing early, often, and as many as you possibly can before that ecological mortality event strikes. Keep in mind that we're making it sound like this is something that is done intentionally. This is just through natural selection favoring one strategy over another. So it's going to favor a strategy that results in higher fitness. And in this case, if you have a lot of ecological mortality, what is favoring higher fitness is to reproduce early at a very early age and not delay your senescence. If you have very low ecological mortality, then the selection and the higher fitness organisms will have this delayed senescence. So here are some data from this Virginia population. And what we find in the possum is, again, we have two different situations of the ecological mortality. In one condition, we have very high ecological mortality. This is on the mainland. So we're going to compare two populations here, the mainland and the island population. Mainland has very high ecological mortality, so there's probably a lot of cats and dogs and other reasons why they meet their demise fairly young. And as you can see here, they tend to pass by the time they're 28 months old or so, 28 to 30 months, whereas the ones on the island are living a lot longer, and they don't, typically their lifespan is around 45 months. So there's a huge difference in how long they expect to live based on this difference in ecological mortality. And so the idea is that we would expect, since the island population does survive longer, that they would have, through natural selection, evolved some delayed senescence, and that this mainland population would not have evolved this delayed senescence because they're not going to live long anyway. So why would we have good genes for living a long time when they never really affect your fitness because ecological factors take you out before you can experience the benefit of those delayed senescence factors? This is them establishing that, yes, the island species tend to live longer. Then what they do is try to compare the concept of senescence in these two populations. So remember our definition of senescence. It's decline in survivorship as you age. It's also a decline in the organ systems as you age, the repair mechanisms, if you will. It's also a decline in your reproductive ability. So what they've done here, I mean, we could definitely see that there's more senescence in this mainland population because their survivorship is definitely decreasing much faster on the mainland than they do on the island. So we see that it does affect survivorship there. What we can see down here in C is they are comparing, in this case, they're looking at sort of tissue health, if you will. And they're comparing the mainland and the island population and looking at collagen fibers taken from possums of various different ages and looking at essentially how strong they are, how much time is required before those fibers will break. So you're taking this strong fiber, which makes up, a lot of your connective tissue, your tendons and ligaments and stuff like that, and they're applying pressure to them and then looking at how they break. And what you're seeing here is the data points are showing us doing this at different ages. Now, it's really the slope of these lines that is most important, because the slope is telling you how quickly does that change with age. And if you look at the slope in the mainland population, it's much steeper. So the change in the strength of the collagen fibers in your mainland population declines much faster with age than it does in this island population. So these collagen fibers in your island population don't deteriorate as rapidly as the ones do in the mainland population. So we're seeing at that tissue level, at that cellular level, that we do see evidence of increased senescence within our mainland population compared to our island population. So we do see evidence of senescence there. Over here in B, we're looking at the reproductive senescence. And we're going to compare the mainland and the island populations. And one of the biggest things we're going to look at here is the difference between the first and second year. So in essence, what we're saying here, this is our first year on the mainland, and this is looking at the sort of the growth, if you will, of that litter. So we're looking at litter mass over age, and this is looking at the growth of that litter over time. And in the first year, the mainland population did quite well, but in the second year, they did not. That difference right there, that's senescence. Because remember, senescence is looking at the decline in your reproductive ability over time. And so between year 1 and year 2, you really dropped your ability to increase the growth rate of your litter. And so there's a big reproductive senescence here on the mainland. If we do the same comparison down here on the island, look at these two lines. These two lines are virtually indistinguishable. And so what it's telling us is that whether you're reproducing for the first year or the second year on the island, you do about the same. So we see a lot less reproductive senescence down here on the island than we did up here on the mainland. So we're seeing a nice correlation between ecological mortality versus physiological mortality. How it affects survivorship. So clearly they have extended the lifespan. Natural selection has extended the lifespan on the island because there is lower ecological mortality. So we see less senescence in survivorship. We see less senescence here with this slope in the strength of their tissues, and that would involve repair mechanisms, etc. We also see significant reduction in the reproductive senescence on the island compared to the mainland. So in all aspects of how we define senescence, this island population has a much lower rate of senescence than the mainland population does. And again, it's because of that high ecological mortality that we see much faster senescence in the mainland population. From the data presented here, we really can't make that distinction between those two hypotheses, which, by the way, don't have to be mutually exclusive. A mutually exclusive hypothesis is two hypotheses where it has to be one or the other. And in this case, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be a combination of both. So in summary, we know that senescence and the evolution of senescence, the way natural selection works on the aging process, is strongly tied to the type of mortality. High ecological mortality will be a higher rate of senescence. Lower ecological mortality will select for a lower rate of senescence. And again, we don't know exactly when this happens, which of the two hypotheses is in play. It can be one or the other or both. So it may be that over time we just accumulate more harmful mutations and then those get expressed later in life. Or it could be that we actually do have this trade-off between reproduction and maintenance, which again is very likely, and both of these are likely to be having an effect in most populations. And so it's hard to tease those two things apart and determine how much is deleterious mutation contributing to the issue and how much is antagonistic pleiotropy contributing. Now, one other thing that we want to mention here that goes along with reproductive senescence is the concept of menopause. So menopause is a little bit difficult for us as evolutionary biologists to wrap our heads around. One is, for example, why does a female's reproductive system age faster than their other physiological functions? Why do we live past reproductive age is, of course, another huge concept that we can't explain very well. If you look here in the top graph, they're showing that there's clearly much higher rate of senescence, particularly reproductive senescence in this case, in females than there is in males. So males can continue to have reproductive success very late in life, but females don't. So there's this huge drop, shortly after 35 in reproductive potential of a female. And so part of the idea here is, were there selective pressures that favored that? And if so, what are they and how did that evolve? Because it just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense that for females, their reproductive ability drops so drastically. And we can see that down here as well, where fertility is dropping very drastically, but the rest of our physiological function is declining much more slowly, much more like we see up here with males. And so the idea is, why does that happen? Why do we see that sort of disconnect there? Why would selection favor us to physiologically be fine, but reproductively we're finished? So there's two major hypotheses that the book presents, and we're not going to go into all the detail that they do in the book, but one is called the artifact hypothesis, and this is really just saying it's a non-adaptive thing. So evolutionary biologists tend to not enjoy these kinds of hypotheses a whole lot because it basically just says, well, this is new. This is something that hasn't been around for a long time. If you were to go back and look at ancestral populations, females didn't really live much past this reproductive age. And of course, males didn't live very long either. And so the fact that we're living longer now we're just seeing this as an artifact, which is a possibility, of course. The evolutionary explanation, on the other hand, is what they call here the grandmother hypothesis. And what it's trying to say is that this really is adaptive. The idea that the female stops reproducing but then continues to be physiologically healthy is an adaptation that promotes kin selection, basically, because what it does is it allows this female to help her children raise offspring. By doing that, they're increasing their indirect fitness because those grandchildren are related to them by 1/4. And then if you also think about it, not only are they helping increase their indirect fitness, but by not reproducing, they're reducing the competition between, let's say, themselves and their daughter and those children. So if they kept reproducing, there would now be competition between your children and your grandchildren for limited resources. And so they're maximizing their indirect fitness by helping care for their grandchildren. So that's the evolutionary explanation. And again, it could be either one of these things. Now, in this case, these typically are more or less exclusive hypotheses, because this one's saying it's not adaptive and this one's saying it is adaptive. So in this case, we do sort of have to pick one or the other. But in our previous slide where we had two hypotheses, they could both be part of the answer. So that ends part 5 of chapter 13.